I do. I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if it's way too wide for your screens and I can move it to my desktop. Oh, don't leave meeting, not that button. Other button. Okay.
It's definitely one vision, but I think if the focus is the artboards, we're good.
Yeah, so I was curious to get other designers' feedback, or rather thoughts around when you're trying to bring forth a visionary idea, it often looks like small incremental changes. But when you're trying to communicate that through epics and issues, it's sometimes hard to keep them connected for other groups. So a way this has appeared for me with working with source code and code review is compliance is trying to introduce a feature where we're just trying to expose the status of these APIs within a merge request. And I get some feedback around this seems incomplete, this seems like not a great user experience. And I will admit that I even don't love the user experience, but to get a first release out, we can't do everything under the sun. So like I would love to build towards something that is more insightful, that provides more feedback to the user of like what to do. But what we had validated with customers and users already was just at least knowing the pass-fail situation of a specific API is more useful than nothing, because today those customers are having to, or users are having to leave the GitLab platform, go check those things, and then come back in. We're trying to keep them within GitLab and not having to jump back and forth between everything just to go discover something. So I guess my question is, how have you kind of helped communicate that? This vision I have right here on the right might not actually be where we end up going. It's like what I have painted in my head. But the first thing that we're like shipping is much smaller, and it just tells you like the name of something you've created, and its corresponding API would show up in a pop over here. But you're not going to get much more feedback in terms of that, just because we don't know a lot of information about it yet. We just know like the pass-fail status from the back end. So I'll stop talking.
The story that you said makes sense to me. I mean, I think it's just a typical thing that we all fear as designers, is people thinking that our work is incomplete. So as long as you show them in context and explain your reasoning as to why you are iterating with this particular approach, it seems absolutely fine to be shipping stuff like this. I think the product principle of having a low level of shame comes to mind here. As long as it's servicing some part of the job that you're trying to serve, it's a good stepping stone, and then you can just incrementally add stuff onto there. So the feedback of this feels incomplete, you should probably just reply with sort of the premise that you talked about just then, and that seemed fine. And getting that across via video, or getting that across via comment, or whatever it may be, I mean, whichever is the most useful way to tell the story.
Yeah, all those things make sense, Nick. I agree with that. Were there any other thoughts?
I put mine in the agenda. I'll add that concerns need to be specific. It looks incomplete isn't a specific concern. So in your collaboration, just ask questions like, why does it look incomplete? Or how does it looking incomplete impact the user experience?
Right. So an area where I've gotten like specific feedback is, what is a user supposed to do with this failed API? I'm like, well, I don't know, because I don't know what the failure is, because we're not collecting that yet. So it's kind of hard to give users good feedback on what to do with it if we don't necessarily know how they're supposed to resolve it.
And why is it valuable again then?
Because at least if like everything was passing, you would be able to know like you're good to go. Whereas right now you just have to go outside of GitLab and go check all these things. You know, oh, okay, they're all passing. Okay, good. This merge request is healthy then. We can approve it knowing that the APIs are ready to go. It's not removing the entire need to go and check these things, but at least tells you, okay, I definitely need to go look at the villains API and go figure out what's going on there. It does assume that people know a little bit more about the feature, but yeah, it's kind of hard to do it all at one time. Especially when it's stuff that happens outside of GitLab.
Right, so I didn't realize I'm not muted, sorry. So they didn't know that there was no failure before though, right?
They
didn't know there was a failure before, sorry.
Yeah, it'd be one of those things where they were manually checking things through some other bot they've created, or they go to an external site, or it's a part of their development workflow that they're trying to discover the status of these other APIs out there. And it's more that they want to bring this information into the merge request so that people have more awareness of these dependencies that are related to these code changes. It could be something that's missed by a new team member that wouldn't know about these things. Yes, they might need to go ask more questions now, but at least something has maybe caught their attention in the merge requests page now to let them know something has happened.
So, I mean, I would think that's kind of MVC, right? You're allowing users to raise awareness of failures within GitLab itself, and they're, you know, not using as many tools to spot that. And then next, think about like what those failures mean and how they can fix those.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think I was on the same track as like what Nick was saying, and you too, Alexis, of just keeping it short toes. And the thing that I struggle with though is I don't want to always mock up a vision to help illustrate where things might go one day, because I don't want people to attach themselves too much to like a UI per se. I just was wondering, how do I like get people more on board with like, yeah, we know this is just an iteration of many to come. We don't have to talk about what the final state's going to look like to ship the first thing.
There's a couple of concepts I find useful. One is the concept of like fuzzy goals. I think Dave Gray made this, but basically he talks about thinking about the future in terms of like a cone shape, and the cone shape sort of represents the probability or possibility space. And sort of the closer you are to the current day, that the possibility space is like a little bit narrower, and then the further you get out, the wider it gets. And sort of like communicating and thinking about stuff in that sort of context, because you know the vision that you have will be iterated as you learn more with the small increments that you ship towards.
Sure.
So, and I think a lot of people probably understand that within our culture within GitLab is very iterative. So I think there's an inherent understanding that visions will change over time. So you could communicate that, but I also think people understand that as well for the most part. And then also the concept of taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back as a way to design within GitLab as well. So thinking about where are we going with this, and then cutting it back to make it an MVC as much as possible, and that showing the 2 versions of the very smallest MVC and like the next steps after that in tandem is really useful. There's a number of like really well, it's very useful for developers to understand how they should configure their code in a particular way, which starts to set them up in a particular direction, so they're not MVCing themselves into a corner. And then it also helps other people provide feedback on those 2 levels of short-term and long-term, and it gives the perspective of why we're doing stuff the way we are. So I think designing and showing short-term and long-term thinking Even though your certainty on what it will be as you go out longer term is narrower and narrower. I think showing those two designs is really useful if you have the time to do it. But obviously, it takes time. So balance the amount of time that you have with what you're trying to convey, and the more important stuff, show two designs or more, and the less important stuff,
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I think it all just, again, comes down to just continuing to get better at communication across the board, even when it comes to design.
There's also a discipline within futurism called scenario planning, and you can read up a lot about scenario planning within you can just type it in Google and find a lot of stuff there. But scenario planning also talks about particular scenarios based on what sort of emerges as you go along the time. And that's another way to also consider this problem. I'm just giving some frameworks.
Sure. Mike, did you want to elevate your question about the pattern language for widgets?
So rather than, anytime we need to put something on an MR that provides value, rather than having these this idea that we have to ask permission or have a phase gate to do that, we should have a pattern language. So that would mean that we grab a component. The component has states like, this is the minimal widget. Here's a more complicated widget. Because we also have this value called I don't know if it's a value, but mantra called on by default. So if someone has a concern that adding a widget is going to somehow clutter the MR page, we really need to put that on there and have it on by default so we can learn. If somebody has to go through an extra step to enable it, then we've put a barrier to our learning. Let's see, there was another, yeah, you're answering it. Did you invite contribution to your vision in Figma? So if somebody's pushing back kind of hard, just say, not just, but invite them to help make it look more less minimal, or what was the phrase that they use? Incomplete. Say, well, let's ping pong some ideas here. That can help.
Incomplete would be my summarization of the feedback. I think what I am learning I didn't do enough early on was get more agreement across the board early on. And so it's just been a little bit more painful getting into the build track of now questions are arising. It's like, we're kind of late in the game to be going back and making all these revisions. It's causing tension around how we actually plan the next couple milestones. But I did want to address your first question about, is there a pattern? I won't dive too much into it because I want to talk about this more as a broader question, not necessarily specifically just to this one, but we'll be working with Mike Nichols on more of a think big session to incorporate all the different styles of the merge request widgets that could be introduced into the MR page to make that experience a little bit cleaner and make more sense, because now we have a lot of them. It's not just one or two, it's 6 or 7 or something like that. So now that we have numerous options, I think it does make sense to start defining a pattern. So I guess in the spirit of iteration, this won't be a part of making that holistic vision, but it will be incorporated in the future into a better experience for configuring, and then probably the way that they all render too in the merge request would be awesome. But yeah, I think it's just hard when I've engaged design in the past and a little bit PM, and there's some feedback, but it's not super strong until then we get close to the build track, and I was like, oh, now we're really opinionated on it. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that we hadn't formally agreed upon some things in the past. My bad. But
I like the think big session is a great step. That's really cool.
Yeah, I think it's a great follow on to say we my group appreciates that there could be a better experience, and we will contribute to that long-term vision, but also acknowledging we do need to ship a small feature to start bringing value to users. But we do run into that tension point, Mike, that you brought up about this impacts a very active part of the product. And so there's a lot of resistance to like wanting to introduce more because that could degrade the performance, which is obviously a big sticking point with MRs right now. So we are keeping a feature flag on it. And the one thing we've been trying to talk with source code about is like, what are the terms for making this on by default? We're happy to meet those terms, but help us understand what those look like. Is it, not reducing page load times, or not increasing it any further with this widget, or whatever it might be? It's kind of hard to know as an outside group how to impact that area. So Alexis, your question around like, do we have a roadmap? This is one of the things like I struggle with, is when I'm like really trying to deep dive into problems, I focus pretty closely on the apparent problem at hand. And then I'm like thinking about the roadmap in like longer terms, but it just seems like as soon as I start presenting a mock-up for like a long-term vision, it starts becoming a bunch of issues to go implement it. Like not yet, like it's just like a future state thinking. I'm not trying to tell you, hey, let's actually go build this thing in 3 milestones from now. I'm saying like, this is something that I could see becoming a thing, but don't attach yourself to it. But as soon as it shows up in issues, then it's, I've got customer X, Y, and Z interested in this feature because of this. And I'm like, that's great, but sorry, I didn't mean to get everybody excited.
I mean, that seems more of like a product issue, right? Like, or like we need to like vet those ideas through research too. But yeah, I mean, that's what I was gonna say. Like, how are you capturing if someone's like, oh, this doesn't seem like enough, like I want this, are you creating issues around that, or how are you capturing those thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we haven't even released the first feature at all. So we just have had so much discussion around it. And the biggest thing has been trying to scope it down to be small enough that we can technically implement it within like 1 or 2 milestones and not stretch it out over like 10. So that's probably been the thing that's scoped down the feature set the most, while still trying to be true to the problem, knowing that it's not the holistic solution. It's just like the first couple of milestones we're going to release for.
So I think that's where like the roadmap comes in handy, or just like understanding those because I guess it sounds like you're having those scoping conversations, and then you have the documentation of like, hey, this is in the future though. Like, so you have it documented so people feel better, like we're going to get to it, but then you continue scoping each of those ideas down to.
Yeah, I think my tension, I feel, is it might change. Like we might release this first feature and find out it's really not yet valuable at all, and we just kill it. So I'm not even promising that that's the future iteration. I kind of want to see how this first one performs and better understand if even my assumptions of what makes sense for the next iteration are valuable, because I don't even know yet.
So that sounds like maybe a discussion with the team of like, hey, these are ideas that we need to validate, like don't get stuck on them. But you still want to document things, and then maybe it's documented as like, we're still validating this idea, but like we might get to it, we might not, depending on validation. Anna, do you have ideas here? Because I feel like this is your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I mean, what I keep hearing is that there are like many assumptions floating around, like even saying like there are certain things that are not validated. And I mean, even from a research perspective, you could aim for some validation before it's being implemented, just to get a gut check. And it might even help with, convincing the rest of the team, or like just having better arguments. It's just a matter if you have, time to do these things, if you want to prioritize it, and how much of a technical effort it is to implement it. Like that's always usually the trade-off, if you want to do the validation before or after. But yeah, it almost sounds like there are a lot of things unvalidated, and it might be useful to check some of these things beforehand. Yeah,
that's fair, Anna. And I'll wrap it up with this comment, just so we can get the last 5 minutes at least for Daniel's post that he on here. We thought we had enough validation around the initial MVC that we wanted to approach with. And then it was as we were getting to actually try and schedule it, like in 13.12, now we're like kind of meeting some resistance. So that's where the tension point arises. Daniel, I'll let you carry on to your point.
No, it's just like a quick check on the wireframes. I don't know if anyone else has been using them, but I went into it for the first time and I was like, there's nothing wireframey here, and I wanted to know what the state of it was. And so I just realized that Libor is working on it, which is good. But yeah, like I was concerned if I was looking at the right thing or the wrong thing, or just trying to get a context on it.
Yeah, just to give you some more context, Daniel. So I proposed this a while back, and we were still kind of going back and forth on, where it should live. So, and then as since it was kind of an older issue, Figma's released a lot of newer updates with variants and stuff. So I kind of came back to it with a newer proposal. And so there's some, if you look towards the end of the issue with some comments, we were, debating whether we should use create variants for the different wireframes. And then looks like now the decision is going to be to create a whole new wireframe kit that's like works in parallel with the existing component UI kits. So what it will do is it'll pull in those components from the existing component library, and then they'll just be kind of styled to look wireframey. So that's kind of the next steps. And I think since there's so many different pieces, what might happen, what I'm going to propose is maybe to promote this to an epic, and then we're going to kind of break it down and then, style up different wireframe components. So, so this way we'll kind of divvy up the work. So someone might take, for example, the button component and then, finish that. Someone might style up or wireframe up the table component, for example. So that's kind of where I'm seeing this going next, but I just haven't had a chance to really work on it in the past couple milestones. So I'm going to try to fit it in this one. So I'll make sure to mention you, Daniel, in there.
Oh no, it's all good. Like I said, I wasn't sure like the context around it, if it was kind of like just a initial proposal or whatever. And so I went poking around in there. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Doesn't really seem like a wireframe just yet. The idea that you said that like having it connected to the current component library, I have like apprehensions on that, because if the idea is that it's going to be a one-to-one with just different styling, I would argue that's still not necessarily the wireframe idea. That still ties too closely to the architecture that we have. Whereas the idea could be for a wireframe, I want to look at this in a really rough state with no real ties to past structure or past ideas of what something should be, and keep it a little more loose. That way we can say, well, this doesn't necessarily make sense, or instead of having to say, well, this component looks like this because it's always looked like this, and so I'm just going to toggle the variant and now it's purple instead of black and white.
Gotcha.
Yeah, what Dan was talking about, just made me think about so there's multiple purposes for a prototyper, there's multiple purposes for a wireframe. So what are the initial things that we want to be using this wireframe library for? Sometimes using wireframes is used to like just speed up the design process a little bit and work in lower fidelity. But I suppose if you're mapping one-to-one, like Dan says, the speed isn't so much a factor, because you can do high fidelity stuff and prototype stuff at the same time. So I wonder, like, if we have a very specific use case for what is this wireframe, what is the job that this, write a job statement out or whatever it may be, what is the job that this wireframe library is going to support and help people within GitLab specifically do, that would be useful. So for example, I've used wireframes in the past to communicate stuff at moderate fidelity in order to separate out people's concerns with future visions and the UI and so on, and just use it to convey concepts of what may happen. You can also use wireframes to just discuss the information architecture of a page or whatever it may be. So my question is, what's the job that we're trying to satisfy with this particular wireframe kit, and how is it going to be differentiated from the pajamas kit that we have, which I think is reiterating what Dan's saying.
Yeah, that's a good feedback, Dan and Nick. I should add that to the description of the issue there. But I mean, for me, it is be able to just quickly illustrate an idea with the existing components that we have. For example, you could quickly throw in, you know, set of tabs or table or whatever, and make sure that, you know, everyone that's looking at it, engineering or whatever, they know that this is an idea. It's nothing finalized, it's not done, and it's just a quick way to get a discussion going. So that'd be the kind of job for me. Yeah, I could definitely write it up in issue to make that more clear.
Sounds great.
Yeah, great feedback though. It's
Yeah,
good
and
to
also
hear.
just to kind of expand on that, I think if we reduce the fidelity, that will save a lot of work, a lot of detail from having to translate stuff one-to-one. It's just like, here's a box, it's got a heading, next. I mean, obviously I could do that myself, but the idea kind of expanding on that, how can I make this box the next iteration, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Daniel. There was I was thinking about that as well. I mean, for example, we have so many different button variants, you know, the different sizes of the buttons, for example, and you don't necessarily need all those different sizes in the to illustrate an idea that this is a primary button and this is a secondary button, you know, to go through a quick flow or something like that. So yeah, I agree. And I think that's something that we're gonna have to, or I'll have to add to the issue, like where do we stop kind of with mirroring this this one-to-one relationship with the existing component library. Yeah. Let me make a note to myself to add that though.
For some reason I can't find the issue that you had posted, but I'll try and find it again.
For what it may be worth, to me, like a wireframe kit is more of like a manifestation of what I would probably just draw with a pencil. Like I'm probably not going to draw all the detail on a screen unless I'm like really interested in just getting into work with pencils. But yeah, like you guys are saying, like it's generally just like a bunch of rectangles almost. A bunch of different versions of rectangles with maybe like a unique looking attribute for a button, since it's our primary call to action on a user interface. So yeah, anything that helps just generalize areas. It's almost like the skeleton of like an HTML page. Just like I saw a quick preview from everyone sharing, it was like, here's the heading section, here's the main body. It's almost like, what are those tags that you would show, not necessarily like all the detail of them. Because I actually really love using our current pajamas system in Figma, because it gives me a ton of control over the fidelity of it in terms of like high fidelity. And it's very easy to use as a sticker components. So if I was going to try and use something less specific, I'd want it to be like very vague.
Yeah, that's exactly the bad habit that I was trying to break, is that why use a wireframe, so to speak, when I can just start grabbing components from the already established component library. It's like, done, high fidelity, next.
I agree. Yeah, is it really faster when we end up with two levels of artifacts when we could create an initial level of an artifact with the existing component library? I guess that would reduce the number of choices you have to make up front. Maybe with the full component library, there's I feel like maybe you're hampered by a lot of low-level decisions, but I'd argue you could also just not make those decisions in that moment and come back to it, you know. But Vitika initially started using that for the one-year vision for her team. She needed something that looked vague and aspirational. So I don't believe they're using it for shovel-ready issues or sketching, but you'd have to reach out to her for more info on that. We're at time. I always hate ending these, but I think we probably have other meetings to go to today. I know I do. It's good to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Right.